Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Can you see me okay and hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you all for joining. This is Beta and Brews on the Dablam Southwest Ridge, hosted by the Mountaineers. So for those of you who aren't familiar with using Zoom, I've just included some quick instructions here of how to use it. I'm going to ask that everybody please mute your line and disable your video to save bandwidth during this presentation. And you can do that very easily by clicking the buttons on the bottom there. And are you seeing a yellow? Okay.
Yeah.
Give me one sec. Something's up with the annotations guy.
Yeah, we see that. Oh, it just went away.
Okay, yeah, I just fixed it. That was strange.
Okay.
Yeah, it was in draw mode for some reason. Okay, great. So back to housekeeping stuff. Feel free to use the chat function throughout the presentation. I'm not going to be monitoring it because I'm going to be presenting, but Sky, she's online and she's going to be collecting questions and facilitating our Q&A at the end. So please save your questions for the end or feel free to write them in the chat and then we can get to them later. And so just a quick briefing about the Mountaineers for those of you who aren't familiar with the Mountaineers. The Mountaineers was founded in 1906 and is a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to provide outdoor education, recreation, and conservation opportunities. The organization serves over 14,000 members, including more than 3,000 volunteers and millions of readers worldwide. They're the publisher of The Freedom of the Hills and many other books and are an amazing organization. And I know it's a kind of a crazy time in the world right now, but a lot of nonprofits and a lot of organizations are struggling, and gifts of all sizes make a difference. So if you're in a place to make a gift, I would encourage you to do so. If you're not, we totally understand and hope that tonight's programming brings you some light and support during this time. And I've also included the link in case you are in a place to be donating. So tonight, what we're going to cover is a quick introduction, the trip preparations that went into my trip of going to Dablam, what it was like for me landing in Nepal and then arriving at Dablam, what my climbing experience was like and my summit bid, my descent down from the summit, some lessons learned, and then I'll give you guys some time for a Q&A. I'm going to try to keep the presentation to about an hour, so we'll see how that goes, and then we'll have plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. So just a quick introduction here. I'm trying to cater this presentation to all types of people. So I know people on the line may never have climbed before or may be very, very seasoned in climbing. So I'm trying to cover a range of different things. So this presentation is interesting and relevant to all of you. And I also trust that there's a lot of people on the line who are very seasoned climbers, more so than. So if there's anything during the presentation that you don't understand what it is, if I say a word and you don't understand, feel free to write it in the chat. And then those of us who are more experienced can answer you, and any other questions that those people can't answer or that is particular to this climb, I'm happy to answer at the end. And I also want to caveat that this is my experience and kind of the way our group did things, but you know, climbing is an individual choice and people can do things however they want to. So just a little bit about me. As you can tell by my very dorky name on my helmet, my name is Kim. I've been mountaineering for 16 years. I started mountaineering with Knowles when I was, man, it was a really long time ago. And I did a mountaineering trip in the Waddington Range in British Columbia, which is a very remote range. And it really taught me kind of the basics of mountaineering, and it was the foundation for my education. I did another Knowles trip later on to India and the foothills of the Himalayas, which was also really amazing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Knowles, it's the National Outdoor Leadership School. And then about 7 years ago, I moved to the Pacific Northwest, mostly for access to the mountains. And I've been involved with the Mountaineers since then. And I climbed Dablam in November 2017 with an all-women team, which included 2 members from the Mountaineers who I met through that organization. So I have a lot of gratitude for the Mountaineers and for all of its programs. And prior to Dablam, the highest I'd ever been was the top of Kilimanjaro, which is at 19,341 feet. And it's considered a non-technical climb. And Dablam is considered a bit more technical. So it was a nice jump from Kilimanjaro to to Dablam, and I've done many other things in between, but just in terms of that elevation, it's kind of an interesting data point. So just a little bit of the basics about climbing in the Khumbu. So those of you who aren't familiar with the Khumbu, it's a region in the Himalayas, and it's in Nepal and just on the border of China. And it's a really beautiful area, really well known, mostly for Mount Everest, which you can see in the top right corner there. In order to get to the Khumbu, you need to take an international flight to Kathmandu, and then a domestic flight to a small little village called Lukla. And then from there, you actually trek on foot from Lukla all the way to Ahmedabad Base Camp through a bunch of like very cute rural villages, and it's a really incredible cultural experience to get there. And it's Ahmedabad is kind of on your right side as you're doing that trek, and it's the same trail that you're using to go to Everest Base Camp if someone wanted to do that. And so it's this very iconic mountain that is really known for its beauty and for its exposure. And I'm going to show some photos of that as well. And people usually do this trip in about 3 to 5 weeks. Our group decided to do it in 4 weeks, but it is a long haul to get there, and it's important to acclimatize on your way there. So just a little bit about the mountain. So this is Ahmedabad. She's beautiful. Ahmedabad translates to mother's necklace. Amma means mother, and Dablam is a pendant necklace that's worn by Sherpa women. And the mountain is said to look like a woman kind of cradling her child with the big flanks coming off of it as the arms. And then the hanging glacier that you see in the middle there representing the Dablam, which is that necklace. It's considered to be a high altitude technical mountain, and it has 2 climbing seasons, April and May, or September to October, which is similar to Everest's climbing season. And the summit stands proud at 22,349 feet. And the first ascent was in 1961. A team of 4 men went to the top via the Southwest Ridge, which is the route we're going to be talking about today. And that was part of the Silver Hunt Scientific Expedition, which was led by Sir Edmund Hillary, who once called the mountain unclimbable. So this is the route that we went up and that we're going to be talking about today, the Southwest Ridge. And so this is a mixed route, which means that it has rock, ice, and snow on it. It has steep slopes up to 70 degrees. The rock goes up to a grade of 5.758. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those numbers, that's a difficulty used to describe rock climbing. And it also has ice up to water ice 4. It's considered technical above Camp 1, which sits above 18,000 feet. And from Camp 1 on, there's what's called fixed lines that lead you to the summit. And what those are is a series of ropes that are attached by anchors, and they lead up to the summit, and you attach yourself to those ropes in case of falling and keep yourself safe. And those ropes are on the mountain for the duration of the season, and then sometimes replaced every season, other times left behind. And one other just quick point about this. So base camp, you can see it's a little bit out of frame, but you can get the general idea of where it is, just below 15,000 feet. And Mount Rainier is lower than that. So just as a point of reference for those in Seattle, it's kind of crazy that the base camp is higher than Mount Rainier. So now I'm going to get into a little bit about what we did to prepare for this trip. And so here are some considerations that if you're planning on doing a climb like this, it's important to think about. So one thing for us that was really important was our timeline. So about when we wanted to go and what we wanted to do. And we chose Dablam about a year, or we knew we wanted to do a big mountain about a year before we ended up going, and then chose Dablam and planned our training regimen and all the different things that went into the climb. So ours was about a year, but people can, do whatever they would like. And of course, budget's a big concern, and being able to save money and plan with life stuff being gone for that long. It's also really important to choose your climbing team. With any expedition, as many of you on the call know who do things like this, you're with these people 24/7. You're in really challenging environments. Your body's struggling, your mind is struggling. And so you really want to be around people who you can navigate those challenges with and problem solve, and who you can trust. Another really important thing to think about is weighing the pros and cons of what's called a Western guide service. Western guide services are generally more expensive than having a local climbing Sherpa or going on your own. And in the case of Dablam, it's about 4 times the cost to have a Western guide service, around $20,000 versus a local guide service, which is about $5,000 at the lower end. So that's a decision to make as well. And then if you are going with a local guide, you'd be going with a local climbing Sherpa, and you could also opt for logistics support, which usually comes in with that package, or you could just have the logistics support and then not have a climbing Sherpa. And I want to kind of debunk a common misconception about Sherpas. Many people think that all Sherpas are people who help you climb and or carry your bags. That's not really true. Sherpas are actually a community of people, and Sherpa is commonly their last name. And Sherpas can be mountain guides, but Sherpas can also be many other things. In addition to that, people who are not part of the Sherpa community can have the same job as a climbing Sherpa. So it's sort of like a catchphrase that has been used and commonly used, but I think it's important to call out with the actual kind of ranges of what Sherpas, who Sherpas are and that what they can do. And they are really strong climbers, and a lot of them do work as climbing Sherpas. So we had some really great team members who filled that role for us. And you can also have what's called a Sirdar, who is somebody at base camp who's sort of the manager of all the different Sherpas, as well as cooks and porters. And porters are the ones who are able to carry your bags, like your technical bags, to base camp. Another thing to think about is your itinerary. If you're booking an international flight and kind of coming all the way or going all the way to Nepal, you might want to think about if you want to travel before or after the trip. I think it's important to travel after, just so you aren't, splitting your focus to different things. You can really kind of focus on what you're doing, and then maybe have a, nice rest afterwards and do something a little more relaxed and fun in a different way. Not the type 2 fun that climbing is or can be. It's also interesting to think about climbing another peak to acclimatize as part of this trip. And then depending on if you are doing this on your own or with a guide, you have to think about a climbing permit in advance. Often a logistical support coordinator will get that for you. If you're on your own, you have to figure that out. And then in terms of your travel visa, you can get that on arrival, which is pretty easy. So those are kind of the more logistical considerations. And so now for training. So I did some physical training with a woman named Leanne Wolf, who's part of the Seattle Mountaineers community. And she is the fitness director at Vertical World. And I did some personal training with her, and she said that you should train harder than you think the climb will be. And I feel like I did fulfill that, and it was such a good piece of advice. And I've included her contact information if anyone wants to reach out to her for advice or training or anything. She's great. And I think that what was really important for this climb was a combination of aerobic conditioning, high intensity intervals, and strength training. In addition to the physical, the mental training for this climb is really, really important. It's known for its exposure, which means there's big drops on either side on those big ridgeline arms that you saw in the photos. It gets super cold and your days can be really long. So it's really important to train both your body and mind for what's to come. And it's also really important to have technical training under your belt to really have your rock and ice skills dialed, understand what it's like to do mixed climbing where you're transitioning from rock to ice or vice versa. And then on this climb with the fixed lines, it's really important to understand rope ascent and descent. And by rope ascent, I mean Jumaring and being able to climb and Jumar simultaneously, and understand how to kind of manage the rope and different prosthetic systems and things like that. And then for the descent, being able to understand methodologies for that, because each of the fixed lines have different levels of tautness. And so for some of them, they're too tight for you to actually put your rope into an ATC. And sorry if this is a little confusing to those of you who aren't climbers, but we'll get through this part quickly. But essentially, the ropes are different tautness, so it can be really tricky to know which skill to use at what time. And so if you have a bunch of kind of tools in your tool belt, it makes it a lot easier for you to navigate those things. So being able to prusik or use an ATC or different things like that. And it's really good to practice this stuff either in a mock scenario or on a climb in the Northwest or wherever you may be. If you're able to, it's also important to try to acclimatize and just get used to kind of that up and down for your body. And I think it's also a really good excuse to gain a ton of elevation, which is great for training. It's also really important to be proficient with your gear and your layering system. And some recommended climbs in Washington to get these all this training dialed is Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, specifically the North Ridge, which is the ice route. You can see that in the photo. Shuckson early season or the Liberty Bell Range. And now onto gear. So this is what my floor looked like the day before I left, and everything was pretty organized, which was great, but it was a lot of stuff. And I think it's really important to train with your gear, as I mentioned. And for this climb in particular, you're really packing for 3 things. So you're packing for Kathmandu, you're packing for the trekking portion, and then separately you're packing for technical climbing. And your technical climbing gear will be sent ahead of time on yaks to base camp, and you won't see it until you get there. And so that's a convenient thing, but you want to make sure you have everything you need at each kind of chapter of the journey. And a lot of this gear is really expensive. So if you have access to pro deals, take advantage of them. I save so much money through my pro deals. And as Mountaineers members, people do get pro deals. So something to think about. And if you do feel like your expedition may qualify for a sponsorship, try to go after it because it really does help. For me, one of my favorite items was a big puffy jacket and puffy pants by Montbell, which is one of the organizations that sponsored our trip. And those kept me really warm. And my big puffy jacket had pockets in the inside, like many do for water bottles, so that when you're sleeping at night, you can put boiling water in those water bottles and keep you warm, which I did all the time, and it was awesome. I also made the choice to have 2 sleeping bags, and this was a last minute decision, one for trekking and one for climbing, because I didn't want to carry my negative 20-degree bag with me while I was trekking, and I thought that was a really useful thing to have. It's kind of a last minute splurge, but I was glad I did it. Buffs are really great. It's really windy on the trekking portion and on the climb, and the air is really dry, so it just helps you, you know, from inhaling kind of all this harsh air all the time, and kind of can prevent you from feeling that scratchy throat all the time, although you'll probably feel it anyway if you're in that region. Another favorite thing is a camera holder by Peak Design. This is a recommendation for another mountaineer, Chuck, if you're on the line. And it attaches to your backpack strap, and it's just really convenient. So you can just click it on and off and take photos and put it back, and it's awesome and really durable. I'd also recommend holding a pair of sleep-only socks and then using them for the summit push if you'd like super warm socks. And some things that you definitely shouldn't forget is a high lumen headlamp. A lot of climbing in the dark, and it's great to have that. My headlamp actually died on my way back down to base camp on my descent, so I was really glad I had those extra batteries that we're always told to pack. It's also important to bring cash for local cell data and for food. Even if you have your food itinerary mapped out with a local logistics coordinator, a lot of the times you might be craving something and you can be at a tea house and they'll have it, and it's just awesome to be able to just do that. And you also can buy little cards to have access to their cell towers. Another thing that I really liked was electrolyte drink mixes, an emergency, hand sanitizer, and soap. The hygiene there is very poor, and there's yak dung everywhere, and it's used for the fires as well. And so it's just in a lot of places, and to keep yourself safe, it's just really good to have that. It's also really important as part of your kind of pre-trip coordination to make sure you are working with a doctor to get the prescription medications you may need in case of AMS or any kind of emergency. And even more so than that, it's really important to make sure you know how to use those medications if you have to. So a printout of how to use them is really valuable. It's also great to bring over-the-counter medications, things for GI support or cold, flu, cough, stuff like that, because those things happen to a lot of people above 5,000 meters. So some other tips for packing, having a glove system with dexterity. It's really important to have good use of your hands when you're climbing, especially on the technical sections of a mountain. One thing you can do is add accessory strings to zippers so that it's easier to grab them when you're wearing thick gloves. It's important to have your gear well labeled and organized. A favorite tip from a friend of mine was to put duct tape on stuff sacks and write with a permanent marker what's in that stuff sack, which is great. It's also worth noting that water can freeze inside the insulated Nalgene covers. So, up to you whether or not you bring them. I brought them. I'm glad I did, but I did recognize that I didn't have access to water when I was super high up. Electronics die quickly at altitude. And for the ladies out there, a shiwi is a device that helps you essentially pee like a dude. And for me, it was hit or miss, quite literally. And I ended up opting for a Nalgene, which was way easier. You want to have your system for being able to pee in your tent dialed because it is cold and windy, and oftentimes you're on a very steep ledge and don't want to get out in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. So you want to, practice in the bathtub or on a camping trip and make sure you are comfortable being able to do that in your sleeping bag and or tent. Another thing is just to save your high energy snacks that you love for summit day. My personal favorite is the chocolate goo packs. They totally saved me from bunking on the way up. So understanding the risks of a climb like this. So as we all know, climbing is inherently dangerous. Please climb at your own risk. On climbs like this, there's a risk of high altitude illness, acute mountain sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema or cerebral edema, which are very serious, life-threatening illnesses that can happen at altitude. So just know that going into it. Freezing temperatures is also a risk, frostbite and hypothermia and other things. And just keeping in mind that mountain weather can change quickly like any climb. And this photo here is of a storm that was coming in the night of our summit bid. So this is from Camp 2. And you can see that the winds were predicted to get 80 kilometers per hour. And I actually didn't even pack my bag the night that we were going to go up for our summit bid because I thought there was no way we were going. It started snowing and hailing. And then magically at 10 or 11 p.m., when it was time for our alpine start, woke up and it had cleared and it wasn't windy or crazy. So we ended up going for the summit, but that was very unexpected considering the storm that was hitting earlier in the day. And so one other thing that's really important is just to make sure you have the skills to get yourself down the mountain safely on your own. You never know what can happen up there. So it's good just to be able to rely on your own skills. So the risks specifically on this mountain. So I know that even, our community has suffered from the loss of somebody on this mountain. It is a very dangerous mountain. Many of the mountains in this region are. And, between 1959 and 2018, 32 people have died attempting to climb Dablam, which is a sobering number. And it's a hard thing because climbers can do everything right. And you just have to prepare yourself for the risk that you can do everything right and still not come home. And that was something that I know was hard for my family to accept, but it is a reality, and it's good to know that going into it. That said, falling deaths, at least on Dablam, made up the majority of the deaths in this time range. And falling deaths can be considered, arguably human error because they're a result of anchor or fixed line failure, things like not testing ropes, clipping into the wrong rope, rappelling off the end of a rope, things that we face in the Northwest and anywhere where people climb. It's a little bit different with the fixed lines, but it's still equally important to kind of think about what you can do to mitigate those risks. And this was actually the condition of those lines, and the falling risk was a really unexpected challenge for me. And I had no idea going into it that this was going to be what it was. So that was the biggest lesson learned. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But I think it is useful just to kind of know what you're getting into and what can happen on this mountain and others. So now moving on to arriving and landing in Nepal. So kind of getting into the actual trip itself. So arriving in Kathmandu, it's a really awesome, crazy, vibrant, loud, spiritual, kind of intoxicating place. There's lots of hustle and bustle. There's lots of color. There's lots of people running around and temples, and it's beautiful. And there's fantastic local food. These are some momos, which have meat and veggie options, and they're so delicious, and I love the sauce, and I would do anything to have some of them right in front of me right now. They're so good. And then Sherpa Brewery makes some good beer, and they actually make a red ale, which was one of my favorites. So then, as I mentioned, you go from Kathmandu and you fly into Lukla. So Lukla is actually statistically supposed to be the most dangerous airport in the world, according to Forbes, which was really interesting. And it's this tiny little airstrip in the mountains that's, down in this valley. And you land there after this very quick flight from Kathmandu, and then you start your trekking to Dablam Base Camp. And that can be anywhere from probably 4 or 5 days up to 2 weeks, depending on if you end up kind of detouring and doing any other acclimatization hikes or climbs on the way. And throughout this trekking portion, it's really kind of this beautiful thing. There's all these different tea houses and places to stay along the way. People in tents, people are staying in these tea houses. The one in the photo here is one of the nicer ones. And the further you get from Lukla, the harder it is for the different villages to access resources. So it's just, they definitely aren't as this nice as you keep going, but it's a cool experience nonetheless. And it's a really cool vibe. There's just people of all ages from all over the world who are trekking or climbing, and everyone has their own story. And it's just a really fun kind of traveler's mentality, just kind of trekking and hanging out in these tea houses every night. And so this is outside of town called Namche Bazaar, which is kind of the biggest like hustle bustle village in the area. And this was the first time we were able to see Dablam was on the trek right outside Namche. And it was just a really beautiful thing to see this mountain and accept the fact that we were going to go try and climb it. This is a photo of one of the monasteries, which you'll see a few of them on the way, and they're really beautiful. And the prayer wheels are along there, and we couldn't help ourselves but, you know, going and touching them all as we were walking by, as per tradition. Here are some of the local people that we encountered. Everyone was really, really friendly to us. They have so many tourists who come in, but you know, somehow they still always have a smile on their face when they're talking to us. This woman in particular, we were so cold arriving at her guest house, and she immediately, you know, got us some tea and just got us warmed up and put a bunch of, you know, yak poo in the fire. And she was sort of just like a mother and just like, oh, let us in, and got us warm and happy. And it was just really lovely. And this is what a lot of the trekking portion looks like. You're on trail, you have these huge mountains all around you, but you're in these beautiful foothills with, you know, rivers and sort of this low brush. You can see really far. It's just a really nice experience. And then you arrive at Dablam, and it's a pretty incredible thing to see her up close. So this is what base camp looks like. It's a beautiful, spacious, kind of meadow type place with a lot of just kind of empty soil, and all the different expeditions have their own little zone. And at least on our trip, each of us had our own tent, and you could stand up in them, which was really nice and different. And so this is just our base camp tent, and you can see it on the picture there. And then we had a dining tent, and there was a cook tent where they prepared food, and we were kind of just in our own little area. And we were there at the tail end of the season, so I think it was probably quite a bit less crowded than it was maybe a month prior. So this was around, you know, let's see, mid-November, early to mid-November. And there's just always yaks kind of walking through, and their bells, you know, they're coming, and it's kind of a cool experience just to hang out there. And so one thing before you leave base camp and go onto your climb, it's important to do what's called a puja ceremony. And in the Western world, we think about mountains and we think about conquering. In Nepal, it's really different. It's not about conquering the mountain. It's about sort of enjoying the mountain and respecting the mountain in a different way. And so the puja ceremony it kind of starts where you collect all your sharp items, so your ice axes and your crampons, and you kind of present them to the mountain gods. And that's for forgiveness, because in theory, as you're kind of climbing up using these sharp things, you're kind of harming or poking at the mountain. And so that first part's for forgiveness. And then also you're asking for permission and safety, permission to go and access that mountain, and then safety for safe passage. And there's a lot of use of the prayer flags, and they're strung up, and there's an altar built, and everything's kind of prepared for this really beautiful ceremony. And if you're not familiar with the prayer flags, I'm sure everyone's seen them, but not everyone maybe knows what they represent. Green represents water, yellow is earth, space, or blue is space, white is air, and red is fire. And the concept is that there should be harmony between all of those things. And so for the puja ceremony, as I mentioned, there's this big altar with offerings to the mountain gods. Prayers are led by the lama, the holy man or the monk, who is reading mantras and stating prayers, and having this kind of low chanting. And then the other Sherpas are kind of chiming in with baritone sounds. And there's juniper and incense burning, and it's this really cool ceremony. And, you know, as someone who's not understanding the language, you're kind of just taking it in and having gratitude for everything around. And then sort of the chanting and the sounds kind of gets a little bit louder, and then like they just start throwing rice, and it's sort of like this becomes a celebration that kind of erupts, which is really cool. The rice is meant to represent kind of warding off evil. And then they come around and spread flour on your face, which is supposed to represent a beard, which represents long life. And so it's a really lovely way to kind of feel like you have that blessing to then go off on your climb. And so getting back to the route here and more of the beta side of this, I want to touch just a little bit on acclimatization and what that means. So as all of you have probably heard and know, it's important to, you know, acclimatize slowly to get your body used to the elevation. And so when you look at a map like this, you're not just going from base camp, then to camp 1, sleeping there, camp 2, sleeping there, camp 3, etc. You actually have to kind of yo-yo back and forth to get your body used to everything. And the way people do this is different, and people's sensitivity is different, and it also changes, year to year, climb to climb. And so this is just, what we did, and it worked for our team. And so we started by hiking to Advanced Base Camp, which is out of frame here. It's not really used anymore. It's called Yak Camp, and it's kind of almost at Camp 1, but not quite. And so for our first day when we were there, we hiked up to Advanced Base Camp and then returned back to base camp. We stayed there for a full day afterwards and rested. And then the next day we hiked up to Camp 1, slept there, and then we went up and did what's called tagging. So we went up and climbed to Camp 2, but didn't sleep there, and then climbed went all the way back down to base camp. And then we had 2 full rest days before our big summit bid, which is just your, attempt to get up to the top. And so then when it was time for that bigger objective, we hiked to Camp 1, we slept there, and then we climbed to Camp 2. And remember, the technical part begins at Camp 1. And then we slept for 2 hours, and then did our alpine start, and then pushed for the summit. And then you descend back down from the summit to Camp 2, and then sleep at Camp 2, and the next day go back down to base camp. So it's a lot of kind of back and forth, but it's really good for your body to be able to do that. And you can tell by kind of the elevation gains in these different segments. It's not that much elevation gain compared to what a lot of us do in the Northwest, but you have to keep in mind that you're really high up and things are slow going, and it's still really tough. And so just a quick estimate from base camp to Camp 1, it's about 3,600 elevation gain in about 4 to 6 hours. 1 to 2 is a little bit under 1,000 feet in about 2 to 5 hours, and that's all technical climbing. And then Camp 2 to summit is a really big day, going up 3,000 feet when you're at, above 19,000 feet, and then back down. It can take anywhere from 6 to 12 hours to go up. And then you have to get all the way back down. So on those rest days, we made the most of our rest days. As I said, it's just like really beautiful and sunny during the day, and it was very playful for us to just hang out and enjoy our rest days before our big climb. And so now I'm going to get into the climb itself. So base camp to Camp 1. So going from base camp, which is over 14,000 feet, you're basically starting and you're hiking out of frame here, kind of behind that ridge line. And then you're going kind of up this grassy ridge over undulating terrain, and you're on a trail, and you pass Advanced Base Camp or Yak Camp, which is a really nice place for a rest because it's not really used as a camp anymore. And then the trail sort of fades out and you are navigating a boulder field using cairns. And you kind of want to stay high and watch for like slippery slabs and the stuff you'd usually watch for when you're on a boulder field, like unstable boulders. And then you kind of trend left and you look for some fixed lines at the bottom of a large slab. And that's how you know that you're right over getting close to Camp 1. You can start to see tents and things like that. And it's easy 4th class scrambling. You have an option to tie in. There is a line, or you can just, hold onto it with your hand, depending on your comfort level. And this is what the trek looks like up to Camp 1. Really, really beautiful, wide open, expansive view. And then from Camp 1 to Camp 2, so this is when you rope up. And so what you're doing is you're using what's called a jumar to ascend the rope. And a lot of this climbing is really, really fun. It's a 5th class traverse over these like big granite blocks. And it's somewhat exposed, especially approaching what's called Yellow Tower, which is the first crux of the route. And a crux is kind of the hardest part that people always talk about when they're thinking about beta. And it's about a 5.758 at over 19,000 feet. And it has a lot of exposure, and it's a really awesome climb. And then after topping out of that climb, it's a little bit more of that kind of blocky terrain, and then it's straightforward to Camp 2. And so this is what it looks like. As I mentioned, you're on this ridge line. So if you think about Dablam and those long arm flanks, you're coming up the side of one. And so you can see my teammate Purba over there on the right holding on to one of these flakes. And it's just very kind of playful traverse leading up to Yellow Tower, and super, super fun. If this was lower in elevation, I would want to do it all the time if it was, out my door. this is what Yellow Tower looks like. It's a lot steeper than it looks in this photo. There really are some very good holds on this, and sometimes has a lot more snow and ice on it, but when we went, it was dry enough that the whole block of Yellow Tower was snow-free, which is really convenient and made it like much more of a rock climb. And so the holds are there, so it's best not to like jug on your Duma or use it to pull yourself up. Just kind of look for those holds and enjoy the climb. It's really fun. It's mega exposed. There's thousands of feet beneath you, and it's just really cool because you're really doing rock climbing at a very high elevation, which doesn't happen that often. And then you arrive at Camp 2, also known as Camp Poo. And so Camp Poo, has a lot of human waste on it, which is why it's nicknamed Camp Poo. And you can see in this photo, it's sort of this iconic camp kind of perched up on, the arm of Dablam, and it's spectacular. And I remember looking at this photo from National Geographic prior to the climb and being so nervous and just I couldn't believe the fact that I was actually going to try to get to this camp. And when I did, it was amazing, and it was everything I hoped it would be. And it was just such a cool milestone to reach this beautiful place. And it's over 19,000 feet, and it's where you kind of start and end your summit push. So it's like a big milestone and a really cool spot. And the tents that are there are often shared. So for all of the different Sherpa related climbs or people who aren't kind of doing things on their own, there's a system where the tents are there all the time, and then people will use them and kind of sub in and out. And so the funny thing is, it's kind of a risk if you have a tent and you go up for your summit bid, or you go and do something, come back, and someone kind of snagged your tent. Like that happened to us, and it can totally happen. And I imagine it could probably get overcrowded, and that could be a problem. But when we were there, luckily there weren't a lot of people. So it was actually like a nice intimate camp, and we really enjoyed it there. And this is a photo from Camp 2. It's that storm rolling in that I showed a photo of earlier. It's just really dramatic, and you could literally, put your hand out of your tent window with your pee bottle and like dip it out in the middle of the night because it just dropped all the way down. It was very exposed and cool. Yeah, so then from there, you leave for what's called your summit bid. And you do what's called an alpine start, and those are common in the Northwest too, and on many climbs. And the purpose of leaving super late at night for the climb is to be able to have the snow still hard throughout the night, and so that it's a lot safer as you are going later in the day when you are still climbing. And so just a little bit of beta on going from Camp 2 up to the summit. So it's a mixture of rock, ice, and snow, depending on the conditions. You'll hit the second crux of the route, which is called Gray Tower, which is a really steep like rock and ice pitch, essentially. And then you get over to what's called Mushroom Ridge, which is a bunch of cornices hanging off this knife edge ridge, which is spectacular and my absolutely favorite part of the climb. It was so cool. And then once you get up and over Mushroom Ridge, it leads to a flat spot at Camp 3, which is an awesome place for a rest. And so Camp 3 no longer exists as a camp. A large part of the Serac, that hanging glacier that you can see, the Dablam, collapsed and killed 6 climbers in their sleep in November of 2006. And there's some debate about kind of what happened and if it was avoidable or expected or not. But it seems like the general consensus is that they didn't do anything wrong. They were a camp where everyone thinks it's safe to camp, and they were just very unlucky. And a piece of that kind of chunk fell off, which is very scary to think about. But it's deterred a lot of people from camping there. So now it's just a nice place to rest. So once you kind of hit that flat spot at Camp 3, you keep moving up, and it's just a big kind of steep snow and ice, several pitches to get to the top, and you kind of crest up and over and onto the summit. And from Camp 2 to the summit, it's 3,000 feet, and it can take anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. So this is looking at the route from Camp 2, obviously during the day. And you can see that the tents are actually attached to the rocks, which is kind of a cool thing to see. And the route kind of maneuvers up and over towards sort of that spire looking thing. And then you can see the summit kind of shrouded in clouds in the distance on that picture on the left. yeah, it's a pretty incredible part of the climb. And so for us, we did our alpine start before midnight. You can see just kind of climbing in the dark. We had, you know, the weather shift, and we got this weather window, and we got the all clear from base camp to go for it. And so we made our summit bid on the night of the 16th of November, 2017. And this is what it looked like. So climbing up and up and up in the dark is terrifying and feels like it's never going to end, but you're sort of on autopilot, and it's really awesome and exciting. But then when the sun comes up, something changes. And I know those of you who have been on Rainier or Baker, like any of the big, you know, volcanoes or mountains anywhere in the world, you know what it's like to be freezing cold and kind of just trekking towards the summit. And then, you know, sun comes up and it gives you this like vibrant new life in you, and you're just kind of ready to go, and you get to see what's around you, and it's extremely rewarding. And I absolutely loved that feeling. And so when you hit Mushroom Ridge, my opinion, it's the best climbing. It's, you know, these big chunks of ice that you have to navigate around, and you can use kind of anything from, you know, poking your crampons in the ice, like bear hugging it and kind of sliding your Dumar, et cetera. Depending on the conditions, it's more or less, you know, rocky or snowy, and it's just, you're kind of on this very narrow ridge, and there's, you know, anywhere from probably like 4,000 to 8,000 feet, vertical feet on either side of you. And it's just, it's exhilarating and so, so cool. So I absolutely love that portion. And this is what it looks like as you're approaching Camp 3, which is that flat spot up there. So you can see, just kind of for perspective, the climber that's on the left there, and you're kind of just undulating up and down on this ridge that's all covered in snow and chunks of ice. It's very cool. And if you remember the photo of Dablam from far away, that hanging glacier, this is what it looks like up close. And then you crest over the summit. And so this is Purba and I, my teammate, on the summit of Dablam at 22,349 feet. And it was absolutely breathtakingly beautiful, 360-degree views of the most extraordinary mountains in the world. And you can see Everest just in the background there, right under my ice axe. And so it was very cool to be on the summit. It was much bigger than I thought and flatter. I thought it was going to be super skinny, but there was actually quite a bit of room up there, which was nice. It was pretty windy. It was cold, but it was really beautiful. And one thing about being on the top, you can enjoy it, but you also know that you have to get down. And on a mountain like this, and on most mountains, it's quite a big journey to get down. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about that, the descent of the mountain. So I'm just going to give everybody a minute just to read this quote. So this quote really resonated with me because I saw it before I went on the climb, and I knew going into it how true this was. And I think all of us who are climbers, those of you on the call, know, you know, a lot of accidents happen on the way down. And so it's really important to stay, you know, vigilant and aware. Your body's struggling, your mind maybe isn't all the way there, especially if you're high up and you're exhausted. You know, we were on 2 hours of sleep, and you know, it takes a toll on you. So it's really important to try to stay as engaged as you can in what you're doing. And so as a quick reminder, I talked earlier about the falling deaths being the biggest majority of deaths on Dablam, and that they're often a result of anchor or fixed line failure, which is arguably human error. And so for me, that became a very strong reality. It took us 12 hours to get to the top and 10 hours to get down. And for me, it was just really humbling. And this is the part of the climb that I did not expect and did not know anything about. And so that's why I really want to share it with all of you, so that if you decide to climb this mountain or a similar mountain, you're aware of what this is like. So looking at the fixed lines, it's really easy for those falling errors to come into reality, like more so than you would think just reading that stat. It's really easy to clip into an old rope instead of a new one. It's really hard to know what rope is what. Some of them dead end, some of them fray out, some of them are old, and you really can't tell easily which one is the one that you should be on, especially if you don't have someone there with you to tell you which one to clip into. And in addition to that, the anchors aren't always safe or redundant, and the ropes can be weathered. And so it really means that you have to take measures and really think about, where you're clipping in and what you're doing when you're hitting these anchors and these ropes. And it takes a lot of, mental fortitude to think about that and stay aware. Rope management can be really challenging. You can see this mess of rope here. It's super scary. You arrive at one of these anchors and there's just a jumble of ropes, and you can kind of raise up where you're kind of clipped in, and the whole system lifts up. And it's just very confusing to know where to clip and when, and kind of how to manage all those ropes. Another challenge is that it's difficult to test these ropes before committing to them. You're in a high altitude, steep scenario, and you don't know exactly what to trust. And you're often navigating in the dark. You can see probably 8 or so ropes in that photo, kind of dead ending into the snow. And so when you're in the dark, you can only see what you can see under headlamp. And so you don't entirely know where a rope's going to go. And so it's really hard to figure out which is the right rope. And then it's also possible to rappel off the end of a rope. Some of these ropes just fray out, and it's just a very challenging environment to be able to be operating in at high altitude. And, when you're exhausted, and even if you weren't any of those things, it would still be really, really tricky. And so for me, this descent was kind of harrowing. It took us 10 hours to get down, making for a 22-hour summit push on 2 hours of sleep. And our Purba and I was one of our team members. The two of us were together, and the Sherpa guide who was with us was out of earshot. And so the two of us had to descend on our own. And so it took us a really long time, and it was scary. And there was more than one instance where we attached ourselves to the wrong rope and started rappelling down, and then realized that that rope either dead ended into a chunk of ice, or frayed out, or just was not in the right place. Then we'd have to climb back up, go back to the anchor, secure ourselves in, switch over to a new rope, and then go back down and hope that was the right rope. And we did that multiple times, and it just made for a really, really long night and a very scary night, especially when there's thousands of feet of exposure beneath you. And we worked together, and we were able to figure out a way down. But we were just really grateful that we, had each other and were able to make it down. But that said, it did take 22 hours total, which is way more than it should. And so we got back down to Camp 2 and just chugged some water and crashed. And I woke up in the morning after summiting, and I felt this numbing in my hands, and I thought I just kind of slept on my hand weird. And I put my hand in front of me and pulled off my glove, and my finger was discolored, and I couldn't feel it. And one of the Sherpas came in to say good morning to us and kind of check in. And I showed him my hand and asked him if it was frostbite, and he said he thought it was. And so I knew that I had, the job that day of getting back down to base camp with, one hand that was pretty much unusable and numb. And so it was really just my finger that was frostbitten, but the rest of my hand was still really numb, and like on the border of like kind of more frost nip. And so I ended up doing the technical climbing down from Camp 2 down to Camp 1, doing everything with my left hand. So I want to thank you to the mountaineers for making us practice rappelling with your non-dominant hand for all of our exercises that we did, because it came in handy. And if I didn't know how to do everything with my left, I would not have gotten down as easily. So I made it down to base camp, and then because my finger was no longer going to get exposed to cold, or as dramatic of cold at that point, it became safe to try to rewarm the finger. And so this is the day after summit. It was very painful to rewarm my finger at base camp. This was lukewarm water, and it was excruciating. And I didn't expect for it to feel like it did. And essentially, like there's ice crystals inside your tissues. And so it's them trying to warm up, and a lot of my, nerves were already dead. And it was just a very weird feeling to have that experience. And then I'm going to kind of go through just kind of what it was like getting frostbite. I've gotten a lot of questions from people about what this is really like. And I only had known one person who had frostbite, and I reached out to him for some advice, and he had some photos, but I feel like having this documentation may come in handy for somebody. So avert your eyes if you don't like kind of gross things, just fair warning. Otherwise, stay tuned. So this is 3 days after the summit. There was continued discoloration in my finger. It was kind of purpley blue. These small blisters started to form and it was completely numb. It was very awkward trying to pack my bag and do things, and honestly just not knowing what was going to happen. And this is a photo of my finger 8 days after the summit as the blister continued to grow. It was growing slowly, kind of a little bit every day. It was kind of ballooning out to protect the finger. And so every day I was cleaning it and wrapping it to protect it against infection. It became really spongy and weak, and that as that blister expanded and my finger was completely numb and just like really bulky just in itself, and then also with these big bandages. And I did the bandaging myself, or when I was in Kathmandu, I was going to the hospital every day to get it wrapped and soaked in iodine, and some other things. I think it was that. Just in case it was going to pop to prevent that infection. And there was a lot of kind of debate around, like, do you pop the blister or leave it? I left it, and I think it was the right decision. So this is 14 days after summit. This is when the swelling of my finger reached its peak. And as it started to kind of transition down to that joint in my finger was kind of when the reality of like actually losing my finger and having to get it amputated became more real, because it became relevant, or I became aware of the fact that it was kind of worse, and it was right on that border of being able to hold on to it. And in fact, I actually had 3 doctors, both Western and local doctors in Nepal, tell me I would have to cut off my finger. And so there was a point for me where I kind of just accepted that that was going to happen. And you can see I still have my finger, or all my fingers, which is cool. So about 17 days after the summit, I had started to reduce the soaking, which I think was a really great idea. And the swelling decreased. And so it's that balloonness and that kind of watery look that it had just kind of kept going down. My finger's totally numb at this point still, and the nail's kind of getting loose, and it's just kind of dead feeling. And then about 21 days after the summit, the blister reduced and it dried out, and the color darkened almost black, which made me nervous, but was also kind of nice not to have this big bulky thing kind of that I was carrying around with me. And then 27 days after the summit, I did paint my nails to try to camouflage it. And the skin started hardening and cracking, and the sloughing began. And this was kind of an exciting moment because there was just something different that was happening, and I was curious if it was going to kind of start to actually slough off, and it did. And so about 30 days after summiting, the sloughing increased and kind of created this lift, and then started to kind of wrap around the finger, and I could start to see some like healthier skin underneath. And then 31 days after the summit, this is what it looked like. Large pieces of skin were peeling off. It was super painful. I was very impatient. I pulled it too much probably. And the skin underneath was really red and sensitive. And then 33 days after the summit, the skin underneath became less sensitive, and the darkest parts by the nail were still really hard, and they wouldn't really move, and they kind of were digging into the new skin. It was a bit strange. And then 36 days after the summit, the tip sloughed off, and it revealed pink, healthy skin. Yay! Just in time for Christmas, I realized that I might actually get to keep my finger. And that was my best Christmas present ever. And then 57 days after the summit, the loose nail came off. And I was very relieved, because then it just grew out and became what it is now, which is, you know, a more or less healthy, normal finger. So just to kind of conclude everything, I just want to run through some lessons learned just to kind of conclude the presentation. So my biggest lesson learned, as you can probably guess, is to protect yourself from fixed line chaos. One thing that I've read about that I think would be awesome is carrying some flagging tape, and actually on your way up, flagging which rope is the good rope, so you know coming down, if you're in the dark, which rope is safe and which rope is not. It's also a good idea to bring some extra slings and kind of build off of these anchors and make sure that they're safe for you before you commit to them. It's also really valuable to have this toolbox of skills to apply in different scenarios, whether it's prusicking, using your ATC, being able to kind of prusik and jumar and do different things so that you can take the tension off the rope and switch lines and make sure everything's really redundant and safe. Really good to practice those skills, create mock scenarios, really get your systems dialed and know what tools you have and when to pull them out. Also, really important to make sure you can get down the mountain safely on your own. And I think it's really important to listen to your body, and not just that, listen beyond that, because when I came down, I kind of thought I was okay. I was like, oh, my fingers messed up, like I feel fine, but I was severely dehydrated. It took me probably a week to get back to semi-normal, and I had no idea at the time. So drink more water than you think you need, get your electrolytes, rest, just do more than you think your body needs, because your body probably just went through a huge shock, at least mine did. Another thing is just to build more rest days into your trekking itinerary. As you're acclimatizing from Lukla, which is at 9,000 feet, all the way to base camp at around 15, that's a lot on your body. And so like we didn't have as many rest days as I know we all wished. So that's something to think about. And then to end this, I just want to let everyone know that ordering momos is always the right decision. They are amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kim. That was really great. So if you guys want to start typing in any extra questions into the chat, we'll get to them. And I have a couple that came through during the presentation. So the first one is, this is a really good one. How do you find a guide or the vetting process for local guide services?
I would say personal recommendations. If you can find somebody who had a positive experience with a specific company or with an individual Sherpa guide or Western guide, I think that's always the best way. And then I think it's just really important to do your due diligence, do a lot of research online, call references, try to vet someone to make sure that it's, you know, someone you can trust when you're up there. And I think it also really depends on your skill set. So depending on how seasoned you are, you can, you know, have somebody who is going to do more for you or do less. The Western guides may, or, you know, there's some advantages to Western guides for certain things and then local guides for others. So it really also depends on your skill set and where you are in your climbing journey.
Great. So the next question is, what was the duration of your total time on the mountain?
So the total trip was a month. And so we spent 2 weeks going from Kathmandu to Dablam Base Camp, which included going to Island Peak and Island Peak Base Camp, and then another 2 weeks on Dablam and then back out to Kathmandu.
Cool. Next one is, on the descent, were you mostly down climbing or mostly rappelling?
You were doing a combination. So you're not really ever freely rappelling, maybe a couple sections, but usually you have some point of contact with the mountain. And so you're sort of using your hands, and then there's like an airy section, and then you're using your hands again. So it's a little bit of both.
Cool. Then one other person asked if you knew what the cause of your frostbite was, if it was from taking gloves off, if you ever figured out what that was.
That is such a great question. And I didn't mean to touch on that. So thank you to whoever brought that up. In the Jumar, the way that it fit me comfortably was with my gloved hand. Couldn't fit all four of my, so it's kind of, your hand is kind of like this, and I couldn't fit all four of my fingers that comfortably in the Jumar. And so my pinky was like this out. I didn't even realize this until I saw the photos later, but this finger was kind of left to fend for itself, where all the other ones were moving. So I think it's really important to keep your fingers together and keep them all moving.
That's a really great tip. Question from Carol is asking, how many people were on your team and how many Sherpas?
So we had four, our team was 4 women, and then we had, let's see. We had 4 originally, and then 1 left, so then we had 3.
Okay, next question just came in. What boots to use? So what do you recommend for during the climb?
So you're using like the high altitude, like double mountaineering boots. Mine were La Sportiva. I can't remember the model number, but if you want to shoot me an email, I can let you know.
And then did you have any experiences of people ascending your ropes as you were descending, or vice versa?
We really didn't. There was one individual who was climbing with a Sherpa, and it was just the two of them, who we sort of passed by at one point during our acclimatization. But because the weather was supposed to be so horrible the night of our summit bid, no one else even went for it that night except for us. So we were on our own, which was really cool.
Okay, one more. Did you switch between normal gloves and mittens along the way?
I didn't, and I should have. I had really beefy, awesome mittens in my pack, and I didn't use them. And obviously, in retrospect, I should have. But when you're going up there, you're just an autopilot, and it's a lot of rope management, and you're working with carabiners, and so you want that dexterity. But I think that being able to have those gloves and actually use them would probably be valuable.
Hi, Kim, it's Garrett. What was your experience with applying for grants along this process?
So we applied for the American Alpine Club Live Your Dream Grant, and that was a recommendation from some other mountaineers who had received their grant. And you essentially figure out what the timeline is and what the deadlines are, and you essentially just kind of submit kind of a proposal for what you're trying to do, and then you kind of like any kind of application for any kind of grant or anything you're applying for, and there's just a bunch of requirements and questions, and you answer everything they need, and then you apply, and then you hear back. But you do have to do it like quite a bit in advance. So I recommend looking into it like a year and a half before you want to go.
Awesome. A few more coming through. So one is from the top of Ama Dablam, what was the most beautiful?
View of Mount Everest was pretty cool. I think it was just the like the sheer ruggedness of all the peaks. It's just like you just looked around 360 degrees, and it's just everything is jagged and snow covered and spectacular.
Carol is asking, did the yaks carry gear? And then also, how far did the Sherpas go with you?
So the yaks do carry gear. For our trip in particular, we had two very sweet young porters who carried our technical gear to base camp, and then also carried our trekking gear to different locations. And then we had our smaller packs that we were wearing. And so I think I think the only things the yaks carried, I don't even know if they carried stuff on our trip. It might have already been there, but they'll typically shuttle like the Sherpa gear, like the big tents, and all of the cook gear and the all the food that is being prepared at base camp. The yaks will carry that stuff, but you don't really see them, like the yaks aren't with you at all. But you're seeing other people's yaks pass you on the trail all the time. And it's always smart to be on the uphill side when you're around the yaks, because they can kick you down. So it's sort of a tidbit. And most of the Sherpa support that we had stayed at base camp. And then we had the climbing Sherpas who were with us. And we had two with the three of us who went up to the summit. And so myself and Purba, who's one of the women you saw in the photos, she and I had one Sherpa with us, and then our other team member had a Sherpa with her. So they went all the way to the top.
Awesome. That goes into one other question that was, how many of your party summited? Did your whole party summit? And what were the experiences of other members?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't really speak to their experiences, but 3 out of 4 of us were able to summit.
That's really cool. Brian is asking if you had any issues with altitude sickness.
Not really. Everyone got sick in terms of like getting a cold, which, I think is indirectly a result of the altitude, but it wasn't necessarily AMS per se. You get, everybody pretty much who goes above 5,000 meters, you get what's called the Kumbu cough. And it's sort of just this like really dry, like guttural cough. And that is, partially the altitude, but it's really just how dry the air is. So that's an impact of the altitude that's challenging to navigate. And you kind of just feel like you have a cold the whole time. And, that could be from the lack of hygiene. That could be also from the altitude. I personally think it's a combination of all of it, just pushing your body to new heights, literally and metaphorically. So yeah, I think that those things are partially the altitude, but just the general like harshness of the environment as well.
Paul is asking, how long did it take you to regain a normal feeling in your finger?
I started being able to slightly feel it after about a month. It was maybe like 80%, maybe 90% numb. And then when the nail came off, that was 2 months later, and I could start to feel it, I don't know, maybe 3 to 4 months, but I wouldn't even call it fully normal now, 2.5 years later. It turns purple all the time. I can be sitting here in a mild day and it turns purple. And so I just have to be really mindful that I'm very susceptible to frostbite again. It's just super sensitive. And I've heard that it can take 10 years to a lifetime to regain it, to be fully functional and normal.
So scary. Okay, this is a good one. Any regrets or things you wish you would have done differently on the trip?
Yeah, I would have brought some kind of flagging tape to mark all of the lines that were safe, so I knew exactly what to do on the way down.
That's a really good one. Were the newer ropes fixed recently before your climb? Or basically, does anyone have any idea how old ropes are?
I don't know that anyone knows how old they are. Every season they fix new ropes, they put up new lines, but the problem is they don't cut off the old ones often, so you don't really know which is which. But theoretically, there should be safe lines on the mountain that are for that season.
And then one more, do you have future plans to climb other mountains in the region?
Nothing on the docket right now. If the right opportunity presented itself, I would think about it. It feels too soon right now, but it's a beautiful region and we'll see.
Awesome. So those are all of the questions that I've received. If anyone else has any last minute ones, go ahead and ask them in the chat right now. Otherwise, we'll finish up.
Great.
Oh, one more. Okay. What is your advice for other female climbers trying to get into high altitude mountaineering?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say to find some mentors. I think it's really important for women to be able to have community of people to learn from and to look up to and to feel safe in their ability to push themselves. And I think that having female mentors is a really great way to do that. Find some community around it, and then just read a lot, find that support, and train and do all the things to kind of build up your skill set and your confidence.
That's really awesome. Do you have any advice on finding a mentor?
That's a good question. I think through the Mountaineers, there's a lot of forums for instruction and for mentorship. And I think going on climbs and finding people that you jive with, that you can trust, and then you can, ask someone to have a coffee and just chat with you about, what their experience is, and just start to kind of build that community, and then find other people that you're learning with. So like, for instance, if you take the basic climbing course through the Mountaineers, being able to find other women in those groups. There's like small instructional groups, and there's women only ones led by women and who have all female students. And so things like that are a really great way to kind of start to foster that environment and community and be able to start to build your skills. So things like that, I think, can help foster that kind of connection.
Definitely. I don't know what this means, but Tyler is asking, did you have Lukla Starbucks?
I didn't. There might have been a Starbucks in Lukla. I don't know. I don't remember.
Awesome. I was like, I don't know what that means.
Oh, Tyler says there is. Tyler, did you have it? Oh, it's fake. That's hilarious.
Oh.
By the way, one of the most entertaining things about Kathmandu is in the area that a lot of the kind of the tourist area that a lot of people stay. It's sort of this maze of different like crowded streets with all of these little shop windows, and there's fake everything, like fake North Face bags, fake Patagonia this, fake Arc'teryx that, and it's so much fun because some of it, the stuff's great, and some of it's so shitty, and it's just really fun to check it out and see what they've created.
That's so crazy. Okay, a couple more questions that came through. So have you done any of the more difficult routes on Rainier?
I have not.
Okay, a couple more. Carol is asking, how long did you spend preparing and organizing ahead of time?
A full year, Carol.
Awesome. What else? Okay, then also how long did it take you, basically did it take you any longer than it normally would have getting from the summit back to Kathmandu with your finger being frostbitten?
Yeah. So, you know, as I mentioned about kind of the idea around taking care of your body, I came down and rewarmed my finger and, you know, felt like kind of on and off really terribly, and then felt okay. And I wasn't really sure what was going on with my body. I was having some weird symptoms and I was severely dehydrated and didn't really know how bad it was. And so I kind of packed up my stuff and started trekking out and just started feeling really fatigued and almost collapsed, and was just in really bad shape, and all of us were exhausted. And so we ended up actually taking a helicopter back to Kathmandu so I could get my finger to the hospital and get it looked at.
That's great you were able to do that.
Yeah. And travel insurance covered it, and it was a really important thing to have.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Any other last minute questions? Otherwise, we'll start wrapping things up. And one note is we are recording this presentation, so we will download it. And then what we're doing now is we're uploading the presentations to the Mountaineers YouTube page. So I won't have an actual link to send everyone tomorrow, but I'll have a link to that YouTube page in general, and it should be up sometime next week. So if you guys enjoyed this and you want to look back on it or you want to share it with anyone else, you'll be able to.
And Sky, I also have a resource slide in here so folks can take a look at that if they are interested in some of these.
Perfect. Yeah, and if you feel comfortable even sharing your whole PowerPoint, we can do that too. And I can send that out tomorrow. Okay, one last question. Carol wants to know more about the yaks, if they were.
So this is actually quite funny. The yaks, some of them are friendly and some of them you really need to stay away from. Like, I personally just don't trust animals I don't know, so I just stayed away. But one of my teammates thought they were really cute and she always wanted to like touch their nose and stuff. So to each their own, but they can be dangerous and they can also be really sweet. So choose your own adventure.
That's good to know. All right, last question is from Mark. Did you summit Island Peak or just go to base camp?
I personally just went to base camp. I was pretty sick at the time and wanted to save my strength for trying to get up on the Dablam. But 3 of the 4 of us, 3 of my teammates did make it to the summit, and I was super proud of them and cheering for them from down below.
Wonderful. So I will send out an email to everybody tomorrow that'll just kind of have a little recap. I'll include Kim's PowerPoint presentation for that, so you'll get actually these links on this resource slide, and then we'll also send out a YouTube link, and again, you can watch that probably next week. It just takes Mountaineer staff a little time to get it up. And then next week is our last beta in Brews for the season. So next Thursday at 7 p.m. Carolyn Graham is presenting on her Summit of Denali. So another really awesome all-women's climb. And if you liked this, hopefully you'll join us for that as well. Same process that you register on the Mountaineers website, and then you'll get the Zoom link the day of. Yeah, thank you so much, Kim, for presenting. This was really wonderful.
Okay. Any questions, anyone? Let me know. And thanks so much for joining. It's great to have everyone on. And happy climbing.